everyone, I am Vibha Chauhan and welcome to Grazing Classes Funda Clear. So today I am going to discuss class 9th history chapter 5, and also this is the last chapter of this book. Now after this chapter there won't be any chapter left in this book. So our chapter today is Pastoralists in the Modern World. So Pastoralists in the Modern World. So in this chapter we are going to discuss about pastoralists and what are the changes and impacts were on them when the mainstream society was being converted into a modern society. As you know that it was converting in the modern society, but there were many impacts on the pastoralists, on the pastoral nomads because of that. So in this chapter we are going to discuss about all the changes and impacts of pastoralists that were brought up. What were their situations in the modern society? Now pastoralists are those people who rear cattle or any kind of animals, who rear livelihoods, and nomads are those people who don't settle at a particular area. Now they continuously move from one place to another place for their earning. Now they continuously move from one place to another place for their earning. Now that is a means of livelihood for them. So when we say pastoral nomads, means that group of people, that person is moving continuously from one place to another place and has been rearing cattle or livelihoods. Now it can be any animal depending on the reason. Like for example, if it is Rajasthan, it would be camel, and if it is Jammu and Kashmir, it would be goats and yaks. So it is dependent on each area about what animal he is rearing. Most commonly it is cattle and goats. So in this chapter we are going to discuss about those pastoral nomads. Now you might have heard, you might have studied in history and economics. You study about the agricultural movements, we study about the emperors, princes and farmers and many great people. But what about the pastoralists? Now pastoralists really enter the page of historical textbooks. Now why? Because they are marginalized. They are a marginalized society from the mainstream society, and that's why there are many few official records of their history, and there are very few written records. There could be there could be oral records, but there are very few written records. Now in this chapter we are going to discuss about India as well as Africa. Now Africa is a continent that is known for the 50% of population of the tribal communities and the pastoralists. So in this chapter we are going to discuss about India's pastoralists, pastoral nomads, and as well as Africa's. Now let's continue. Let's start with our first topic, that is pastoral nomads and their movements. So pastoral nomads and their movements. Now as I have said that pastoral nomads who don't live at a particular area, they continuously move from one place to another place. So there are many movements like in the mountains, on plateaus, on plains, on valleys. So how were those movements? Let's discuss. So our first subtopic is in the mountains. So in the mountains, now those pastoral nomads who are in the mountains, like in India, in the region of Jammu and Kashmir and Himachal Pradesh, how were their movements? Let's discuss. So first let us discuss about the Gujjar Bakarwals of Jammu and Kashmir. Now Gujjar Bakarwals are a pastoral nomad community or group. As you know that pastoral nomads and any kind of tribal community or any pastoralist community are always a community. When we discuss about them, always see as a group, not as a particular person. So Gujjar Bakarwals of Jammu and Kashmir. Let's discuss how about their movements. Now movements are like this. If there is winter, you know that they live in hilly areas, because in hilly areas there are very green lush grass for their cattle. They rear cattle and goats, and that's why that in the hilly areas, in the mountains there are lush green fields, lush green meadows, and that's why in the month of summers, know that in the season of summer they live at the mountain areas, in the hill areas, and when it's, you know that when it's about to winter, when it's the month of September, October, what would they do? That they would come down, they would go down to the low hills of Shivalik range, you know that, because in winter there would be snow covering up the mountains and there won't be any grass, and to protect their cattle, to protect their goats, to protect their animals, they go to the down hills, like for example the low hills of Shivalik range. So that's what the Gujar Bakarwals of Jammu and Kashmir do. Now that's a very particular movement of every community, of every pastoralist living in the mountain areas. Now whenever there is winter, the snow would cover the mountain and there won't be that much good green grass, you know, that lush green fields, but they would go to the go down hills like in the Shivalik range or any other down hills, and when it's about the month of April, they, you know that after the snow is melted by the sun, there will be lush green grass for the cattle, for the goats to graze on, and that's why in the months of April and May they would go up to the mountains to live there. So that is a process of movement. First they were living at the top of the mountain, then they would move to the, you know, that bottom of the mountain in the low hills, and then this circle is being continued, and that's the movement of Gujar Bakarwals of Jammu and Kashmir. And you know what, that these Gujar Bakarwals migrated to the region of Jammu and Kashmir in the late 19th century, in the middle and late 19th century, and gradually and slowly they settled up there, like for, you know, that they settled up in the state of Jammu and Kashmir, not at a particular place. So that's the movement of Gujar Bakarwals. Now similarly there is another pastoralist community, Pastoral Nomads, that are Gaddis of Himachal Pradesh. Now Himachal Pradesh, that is also one of the state of India, and there lives the Gaddis. Now there are many other, let's discuss about Gaddis. Now Gaddis also do the same kind of movement in the mountainous regions, like when there is winter they would go down off the hill in the low hills of Shivalik range, and in the months of April they would go up in the mountainous area, in hilly areas, for their cattle to graze on. So that's the movement in the mountains. Like in Himachal Pradesh there are many other communities, there are many other pastoralist communities, pastoral nomads, that are Bhotiyas and Sherpas and many more, like Kinauris of Himachal Pradesh. Now they migrated to the mountains of Himachal Pradesh, Jammu, Kashmir, and like in UP, Uttar Pradesh, for the search of good green grass for their cattle to graze on. So that's the movement of pastoral nomads in the mountainous regions, in the hilly areas, like we have discussed about the Jammu and Kashmir and Himachal Pradesh. Now there is one more thing, that in Himachal Pradesh, what you know, that Kinauris and many other pastoral nomads do, that when in the month of summer they would go to the dry forest areas of Bhabar, and when it is winter, you know that when it is winter they would go to the Bhugyals. Bhugyals is a region where they would go, they are dry forested areas. Now in summer they would go to the Bhabar, that is vast green meadows. Now Bhabar are the forest areas with vast green meadows. So in the summer they would go to that hilly area, and in the winter they would go to the Bhugyals. Bhugyals are the regions, are dry forested areas. So that's the movement on the mountains, and you know that this kind of movement is also very useful because it is not hurting the land, because you know that they are continuously moving, they are not settling up at that area, and that's why it would not be overgrazing by the animals, by the cattle, by the goats. So that is movement is a kind of that, it is not an overgrazing movement. Now there is another movement, that is on the plateaus, plains and deserts. On the plateaus, plains and deserts. So just as I said that all pastoral communities, pastoral nomad communities didn't live on the mountains, in the mountains, but many of them live in the plateaus, plains and deserts. So there the conditions were different from that of mountain areas. Now in the mountainous areas the two factors were that according to the seasonal movement, it was that summer and winter season. But in these areas, in plains, plateaus and deserts, what happened was that if two opposite factors for the movement, for the timing of movement for the pastoral communities were the monsoon season and the dry season, that dry autumn, you could say that. So in the monsoon, as you know that for example, let's say if there is a community, if there is a pastoralist community in a dry area, in a dry desert, you could say, and there is thorny scrubs only and cattle can't graze there, so they would simply go when the monsoons are coming, they would simply go to the wet areas, to the rainy areas, on the agriculture areas, and then when there is so much rain, when there is so much rain and there is wet temperature, you could say that sheep could not take, so they would move on from that place and go back to their first place. So that is a circle of movement. You could say that in the monsoon they would go to the dry wet areas, and when there is so much rain, when the rain came, they would go back, they would retreat to their first place in the dry areas, just as was in the mountain. When there was summer, they would go to the winter areas, and when there was winter, they would go to the summer areas. So the same happened here. Now let's say about some communities, like for example the Dhangar pastoral community of Maharashtra. Now Dhangar, you could say that a very big community, a big pastoral community in Maharashtra. Now as you know that in Maharashtra what there is that plateau. Now Maharashtra is located in the region of Deccan Plateau. So you could say that in Maharashtra Dhangars used to live, and many of them were blanket weavers, you could say the blanket weavers, and many of them herded buffaloes. Now there are, you could say that many pastoral communities used to rear buffaloes as well. Like for example Dhangars of Maharashtra, not all the communities used to rear only like goats and sheep and camels. There were many other animals who were reared. So the Dhangars of Maharashtra were there. Now they lived in a plateau area, and when there was you could say that the monsoons were coming, they would go, you could say that they would start their journey for the Konkan region of Maharashtra, where there would be a very good rain harvesting, you could say that. And when they would go there, they would meet the peasants of Konkan. Now there would be a little bit trading between them, because Konkan peasant farmers would give them the rice, and in return they would give something to them, to the peasants of Konkan. And now Konkan peasants would also allow them to cultivate the land in their lands, so that they could produce some agriculture products as well. Like you know that you could say that when they were monsoon season in the Konkan region, they used to sow the seeds and grow crops, and after that when they were returning, they would sow the seeds of rabi crops, because as you know that when they were rainy areas, you could say that the rainy season, they would sow the kharif crops, and when they were we could say autumn areas, autumn season, they would grow the rabi crops. So when they were coming there, they would grow the kharif crops, and when they left, they would grow the rabi crops. So that's the movement of Dhangars of Maharashtra. So that is a kind of movement in plateau, plains and deserts. Now in Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh, the same happened, the Golas of Andhra Pradesh. Now let's discuss the Golas of Andhra Pradesh. Now they also used to do the same thing, that is that they would move from dry regions to the monsoon areas, and when there was so much rain, they would again retreat back to their first place. So that is a movement, and there are many other communities as well. Now as I talked about the Dhangars of Maharashtra, now they moved to the region in the 20th century. Now for the century, you have to remember that 20th century, like for example from the period of 1900 to 2000, when there is 20th century, that is 1900 to 2000, and when we talk about 18th century, it would be the period of 1700 to 1800. So that's the concept of centuries that you have to remember. And why it is so? Because when it was 0, you would say first century, because between the period for the 0 to 100 years you would say first century, and that's why one will step back. That's the concept of centuries, so that would be possible for you to learn it. So as I said that in the 20th century they moved to the region, they settled, you could say that, in Maharashtra region, and you could say that during that time the population, their estimated population was about 467,000, was like that. So that's the story of the Dhangars of Maharashtra and the Golas of Andhra Pradesh. Now there is well-known community, well-known nomadic community, I would rather say, that is Banjaras. Now Banjaras are the well-known pastoralistic nomadic communities. They live in many states. They are to be found in many states of India. Like they are mainly to be found in the areas of Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, and some parts of Gujarat as well, and many other parts like Jharkhand and Bihar as well. So there are many parts where Banjaras can be found. Now Banjaras have their own very long history. You could say that when in the history, when emperors needed something from the tribal communities, Banjaras acted as a medieval parties. You could say that for the trading, for the transporting those goods, Banjaras were very useful for the emperors. In the long history you could read, you could say that in the class 7 and in class 8 you have studied about it. So the Banjaras are a very well-known community, pastoral nomads community. They reared camels, sheep, and many other animals as well. Now Banjaras are also and they're in Rajasthan. We have talked about the plateaus, we have talked about the plains. Now let's discuss about the deserts. Now in Rajasthan, as you know, there is a well-known community, that is Raikas of Rajasthan. Now the Raikas of Rajasthan, they live in the you could say that arid regions of deserts, where there no crop could be grown, where there are really any crop to be grown. And what they would do, that they would do the same thing. In the monsoon region they would go to the areas of Jodhpur, Jaisalmer. From those areas they would go to the different regions. So that's the story of Raikas of Rajasthan. Now there is Meru Raikas, that is you could say that a kind of Raika community. Now Meru means a kind of desert. So Meru Raikas were those people, you could say that, who also herded buffaloes as well. Now buffaloes are a kind of animal who like the swampy wet temperature, who like the swampy wet climate of any area. But because of sheep they had to go back, and that's why they herded camels and buffaloes. Now for the Raikas in Rajasthan, you have to remember that there are many camel fairs as well, where many goods, where many camels and horses are sold and bought. So that's a kind of fair for the trade in camels and horses. So that's the movement of pastoral communities, pastoral nomads in the mountains, on the plains, plateaus and deserts. So that we have discussed about their movements, how they used to move. But what were the changes? How did the colonial period impact them, change them? Let's discuss. So let's discuss our next topic, that is colonial rule and pastoral life. Colonial rule and pastoral life. So you know that colonial government, Britishers in India, impacted many rules and laws for, you could say that, for the restrictions of grazing of pastoral communities, and many more restrictions were made on them. Like all their movements, many restrictions were made. Now they could not move from one place to another place, because Britishers wanted to control. You know that they wanted to fix the areas for each village. They wanted that the villagers live in rural areas and there would be urban population, and they wanted to control those areas by giving them fixed lands and fixed areas to live on. So that's why they wanted them to settle on, so that they could identify them and could gain control over them. As for instance, if there is a person who is continuously moving from one place to another place, so that was very hard for the Britishers to identify him, to gain control over him and to, you could say that, to impose tax on him. That was the very most important point for the Britishers. Now Britishers came in India for what purposes? They came in India for trade, for territory and for revenue, for money, you could say. And that's why they wanted to impose revenue on pastoral communities, so that they could get money, they could enhance their revenue, and that's why they wanted them to settle, and that's why the many restrictions were made. And now taxations was, you could say that, extracted from the pastoral communities in every way it could be, like on salt, on canal water, on land and on animals as well. Like for example, whenever they went to any land, to any forest to graze, for their cattle to graze the grass, they had to show the permit that was given by the colonial government, and for that, according to that pass, the time of grazing was chosen, was fixed, and how many days he could graze over there was also fixed. His cattle, that community's cattle would graze on those fields were also chosen, and on each head of animal the tax was fixed, and many more things were fixed. Like for example, many forest laws were enacted, and according to them, all the forests which produced deodar, sal and teak were declared as the reserved forests. And there were three categories that I had discussed in the previous chapter. So there were reserved forests, where there was no permission for them to enter that forest because it produced for the Britishers building ships and railway tracks. So that's why they didn't want anyone to come in that forest area. So in that forest area there was no allowance, there was no entry for any Indian, you could say, for any pastoral community. And next there were protected forests. Now in protected forests, some customary rights of pastoral communities were given, but under the supervision of Britishers, under the supervision of foresters. Now still there were many restrictions, and their movements were very limited and were very restricted, and whenever they moved to the forest, there were many supervisions. You could say that they moved under the supervision of foresters. And there were many other things like criminal tribes. That law was also passed. Now many more communities, many more pastoral communities, many more nomadic communities were now being considered as the criminal tribes. Now in 1870 it was introduced. Now according to it, because Britishers now started to see them as criminals, because they now were, you could say that they thought that whenever there was grazing by the cattle, that land became unproductive for the timber that they wanted of very high quality, and that's why many tribes were now considered as criminal tribes. And now their trade was also stopped. Now their trade was also shut down, collapsed. Now many more laws like wasteland revenue, wasteland laws, wasteland rules, according to which that land of pastoral communities that were unproductive, that were for grazing of their cattle, were now given to the individuals to cultivate. So as I had discussed in the previous chapter, that Britishers wanted to enhance, you could say that, to make more and to increase the cultivated area, because they wanted raw crops like jute, sugar, cotton, wool from India for their industrialization in England, in Europe, and to trade with it as well. And that's why many lands of pastoral communities were taken away and were given to the individuals, to separate individuals, and they were permitted to cultivate that land, and they were consist as well. So that was the situation. How were the colonial rules in the pastoral communities, for the pastoral communities? As I discussed that there were restrictions in the forest, there were made restrictions in the forest, they were not allowed in the forest, and if they were taxation in every possible way as it could be, and you could say that their trade was also collapsed, their movements in all directions also collapsed, because they now were settled down, they now had to settle down. And how did they cope? We will discuss later in this chapter. So now our next subtopic is How did these changes affect the lives of pastoralists? How did these changes affect the lives of pastoralists? So as I said that, how did these change the life of the pastoralists? Let's discuss. Now as I've said that there was no permission to go to enter the forest areas, and there were very much restrictions. Now because of that, now there was overgrazing on the lands, because there was very little land that was permitted for the communities, for the pastoral communities, and that's why now sheep and cattle, sheep and goats were now overgrazing the land, and that land became intensive grazed land, and because of that there was that unproductive land, there was vegetation, because earlier when they were moving from one place to another place, what was done that when they moved from one place to another place, the barren land was now the more vegetation, natural vegetation grew on that land, and when they came back, the sheep and cattle grazed it, but on the second land that was barren by the sheep and cattle, by the communities, again the natural vegetation grew up. So that's the situation. There was no overgrazing at all. But after that, when Britishers imposed rules on those, imposed restrictions on those communities, now there was overgrazing of lands, and more you could say that pressure on pastoral communities, on pastoral nomadic communities. So there were many changes that were brought to the normal pastoral community at all. Now these restrictions were made, so they had to settle down at a particular area. Their movements were also restricted. Now they could not go to any other area. So that was it. That many changes were brought to the pastoral communities. As I've said that they were the people of their own life. Now for example, let's discuss about the Raikas of Rajasthan. Now they moved from one place to another place, but now at present time they are now at, you could say that you could find them at Haryana, because the separation in 1947, the partition of India also mattered to them, because the high grazing areas, high lush green areas were in many in the areas of Punjab, and many were gone to the Pakistan. So that was it. When partition of India was done, there were many changes on, you could say, pastoral communities as well. That's why, because the land was separated, now cattle had to graze over that lands that were given to the Pakistan. So that's it. Now how did those pastoral cope with that? Let's discuss. How did the pastoralists cope with these changes? So let's say, how did those pastoralists cope with those, you could say, that changes? Now as I said that now you could say that pastoral communities didn't have that much land, that much, you could say, pasture land, and that's why you could say that many started to live their own life, live at a fixed place, live as a normal person. Many more wanted to discover more and more lands, more and more pasture lands for their cattle, you could say, and that's why they moved from one place to another place in search of, you could say that they continued their journey in search of many other lush green areas, and many more reduced their number of cattle. As I said that there was tax on each head of cattle of any animal, and that's why if there are more animals, there will be more tax that has to be given by the community, by that person, and that's why they lessened the number of animals that were in their community, so that the tax would be lessened as well. Now you could say that there were many changes that were brought. Many cattle herders didn't have that much grazing on those lands, and that's why they were lessened in number, and many pastoralists who were a little bit richer, they started their own business, they started their trading and became traders. Many started cultivation on lands and remained at the same place, but many who were poor, who didn't have that much money, what they did that they They started borrowing money from the moneylenders and became and have a very big debt from those moneylenders, and that's why now they have become laborers and workers in many mines, factories and many other places as construction site as well. So that was how did those cope, what was the scope of pastoralists and how did those pastoralists cope with those changes. So now you could say that there are still many over the last decades, the number of pastoral communities have expanded because the situations are changing. As the colonial government, the situations were worsening, but after the independence, there are rights that are given to them, and now you could say that they did cope with the colonial government very bravely, you could say, because they now started their own life, and all of those pastoral communities didn't change in the colonial government. They still lived their own life. That was their movement life. That was, you could say, that nomadic life. That was their nomadic life, and now they are continuing that land. Now that we have discussed about India, about the Indian communities, about the pastoral nomads of India, now we are going to have discussion on Africa as well. So we will discuss now about Africa. So now our next topic is pastoralism in Africa. Pastoralism in Africa. Now Africa, that is known for the half of the pastoralism population. Now in Africa, half of the population of pastoralism lives. Now over 22 million of Africans are, you could say, that pastoralists. Africa, that is a continent, not a country, like you might get confused about South Africa. So you could say that Africa, that is a continent. Over 22 million of that continent are pastoralists, are a kind of pastoralist. Now there are many changes that were brought to those pastoralist communities as well, and in Africa there are many communities, pastoral communities, like for example Bedouins, Berbers, Maasais, Turkans and many more communities that live in Africa. Now there are many changes that were brought to them. There were many impacts that were on them during the colonial and post-colonial times, post-colonial periods, and we will discuss about them. Now they used to rear animals like cattle. You know that they also reared animals like, for example, sheep, goats, camels, donkeys. Now donkeys was also one of the rearers of livelihoods, you could say that, and they also traded. They also do trade in meat, hides, skin and many more products. And now you could say that they did trade as well as reared livelihoods and for transport as well. So that was the situation of Africa. In Africa, as you know, that there are many pastoral communities, and we will see one of the communities. We will discuss about Maasai community of Africa. Now Maasai community, now their population is about 300,000 in the you could say that northern Kenya, and about 150,000 in Tanzania. Now these two countries are of Africa. So you could say that about more than 300,000 population lives in Kenya, and about 150,000 of population lives in Tanzania. So that is about the Maasai. Now there are many changes that were brought to them, and we will discuss in depth about the Maasai community of you could say Africa. Now let us discuss our first subtopic, that is, where have the grazing lands gone? Where have the grazing lands gone? So you could say that before the colonial period in Africa, now the land of Maasais were very large. Now you could say that Tanganyika was a region in Africa. Now it's this history. Now Tanganyika was a region in Africa, that was a German region, and later on it was divided into two states by the colonial government, and those two states are Kenya and Tanzania, and that's why the lands were also separated, you could say that. So Tanganyika was a region region of Maasais, and after it was partitioned, you could say that also that land was theirs. But now many restrictions were now being made on them. Now many of their lands are now being taken, as just happened in India. Now those lands were taken from the Maasais of Africa and were given to the individuals to cultivate that land. Now you could say that the raw materials for them, for their industries, and as well as for revenue for them as well. So that the same happened in India and the same happened in Africa. So you know that the grazing lands were now being taken by the Britishers, and they were confined. It is not that the land was just taken, they were confined, but very small area. That was not a pastoral land, was very bad pastoral land, that was not suitable, that was not good for their animals, for their cattle, you could say. And earlier they lived in the arid regions, semi-arid regions, it was okay, but after that they were given the land that they were confined to was very small. First of all, it was very small, and even in that there was no pasture land for their, you could say that, for their pasture to take a look, for their cattle to graze on it. So the grazing lands have gone. Now those lands were being used for different purposes. Like for example, first of all, they were cultivated land, because the main purpose of Britishers was also to expand the cultivated land. As I've said that they saw the barren land, the forest land, as an unproductive land, and that's why you could say that they were taking lands and were now converting them into the agricultural land. And after that, many lands were now being, you could say that, many game sports area like the Serengeti Park of Tanzania. Now Serengeti Park of Tanzania alone took the 14,760 kilometers of Maasai land, of Maasai grazing land, not living land, but for the grazing land. So that is it. Much of the land of Maasais were now taken, and you could say that many more parks were built, like Sumbru Park of Kenya as well. Now these were the main spots of sports, you could say that, in Africa during the colonial government made by those colonial Britishers, you could say. So you could say that now their grazing lands have gone to the hands of Britishers, and now they were also paying taxes for cultivating any land. As just I said that taxation was extracted, you could say, from every possible way it could be. Now first of all, Britishers, you could say that, gave the responsibility of collecting tax. Let's discuss something about India that is being left. Now in India, what happened was that Britishers first of all gave the responsibility of collecting taxes to the village headmen, or you could say that third party, and now that third party was extracting so much money, so much taxes from the pastoral communities in India, as much as it could be, from every possible way. But after that, Britishers themselves took the responsibility, as they thought that Indians were not right, and that's it. Now in Africa, what happened to the Maasai lands was that now those lands were now being converted into white business, you could say that, white lands. Now white land means for Britishers, because there was a racial difference between them, and that's it. Now they were turning into the white lands markets, and now these Maasai lands could not go into those markets, could not do their trade anymore. So there were restrictions that were made onto them, and their all land properties were taken away from them, and also they were confined a very little land. Now next topic is the borders are closed. The borders are closed. So the borders for them was closed. That is very obvious for you to understand, because you know that all the lands that were taken, now they were still, you could say that, the Maasai who were living, who could move. You could say that in earlier 18th and 19th century, they could move from one place to another place in search of lush green areas, in search of pasture lands. But after that, on their mobility, restrictions were were made by the colonial government, and that's why you could say that all their borders were closed, all their lands were closed, all their lands borders were made. You could say that the parks borders, all the forest borders were made for them, and now they were still a kind of trapped there. That's it, that all the borders were closed for them. Like for example, there now forests were there, and they were reserved forests where the timber was very good, and they could not go there, and any other forest there were many restrictions under the supervision of foresters of Africa, and they were also not allowed to do the cultivation in the white lands, on the white lands, and even if they gave taxes, they could not cultivate that land. And earlier, you could say that during the pre-colonial period, you could say that Maasai used to dominate the cultivators, the peasants of that area. But after that, the situation reversed because the Britishers promoted those cultivators more, because they wanted a kind of, you could say that, a kind of cultivation on the land. And now, you know that Britishers saw the black people, the black livers in Africa as savage, as a criminals, and they wanted their context to be minimized as much as it could be. They could say that they wanted to end their contact between those, but it wasn't possible because blacks were very important. The Africans were very important for them to work in mines, plantations, factories, construction sites, and many more areas, many more factories, you could say that, and that's why they had made contacts with those Africans, with those Maasais. But you could say that inside they wanted to end all the contacts with those areas, with those people of Africa, and that's the story of Maasais. Now our next subtopic is when pastures dry. So when pastures dry, now what happened in Maasai land for Maasais was that now their confined land was very you could say that very arid regions, and it was very obvious that in those years, you know, that drought was very obvious, and because of drought there was no graze land, there was no pastoral land for the cattle of Maasais, of any community of Africa. Now as I said that their land was very small, and that land was very arid region, and that's why in the area whenever there was a drought, what they did earlier was that they moved from one place to another place in search of a very good area whenever there was a drought. But now there were restrictions on their mobility, and that's why they could not move from one place to another place, and that's why now many cattle were dying, many animals were dying because of starvation, because they were starving because there was no land for them, no pastoral land for them to graze over, and that's why many cattle were now starving, and that was because of the Britishers' rules and laws, due to colonial rules and laws. Like for instance, you know that in 1930 when there was a survey that had been made, you know that Maasai had 720,000 cattle, 820,000 sheep, and 171,000 donkeys, but this proportion, this number of animals reduced to half when there was a drought in 2 years, in 1933 and 1934. So this number, this pattern, you could say that this proportion of their animals had gone to half because their pattern of movement was completely slowed down, was completely collapsed, and on that land grazing wasn't possible for the animals. So you could say that when pastures dry, when there were droughts in Africa, the conditions worsened even more for the Maasais, for communities living in Africa. So that is when pastures dry. Now our next subtopic is not all were equally affected. Not all were equally affected. Now what does it mean? You know that you might have been confused. Now not all were equally affected means that the communities that are living in Africa were equally not affected. Now some were affected so much and some were affected a little bit later than that. Like for instance, in the Maasai, what there was that traditionally there were two groups, you could say that. One was warriors and one was elders. Now elders were those people who were elder, who were senior citizens, and now their main work was that they would settle down the disputes. They would, you could say that they would do the discussions for the improvement of the tribe, and they would settle down the disputes or fight between any person or member of that community. And the warriors' main factor was that, main function was that to defend the tribe and do the marchings, you could say that, do the welfare, you could say that, to do the rallies for their, because the rallies, the marchings of those tribal, of those Maasais were very important, were traditionally to strengthen themselves, to, you could say that, to spread themselves and to trade as well. So their rally, their marchings were the most important thing for them, because it was traditionally done and it had its own value. But what Britishers did was that they completely stopped the system of, you could say that, of elders and warriors. Now what was being done, that chiefs were advised, you could say that chiefs were appointed for the Maasai community, and those chiefs were given the responsibility of defending the tribe, of disputing the battles, you could say that, of settling down the disputes between members, and to do the discussions on the improvement of the tribe. So you could say that to handle the tribe, a chief was appointed by the Britishers, by the colonial government. Now after that, what happened was that the chief was accumulated with so much money, and now he lent money to many neighbors, many poor neighbors. So you could say that this system of elders and warriors was ended, but the chiefs helped a little bit. So not all persons were equally affected, but at the same time, on the other hand, there were many poor pastoralists who could not, when there were droughts and there were many dry regions, they could not buy any other animals because their cattle died, and when there was no stock left for them for their survival, they could not buy anything. That was it. But as I said that at the same time in the Maasai, what was happening, that those chiefs were very rich. At any time, in any kind of emergency or any situation of war or any depletion, what they did was that they could buy animals like cattle, buffaloes, donkeys, they could buy, and that's why they were not affected by the war. And you know that when there was First World War and Second World War, they protected themselves from that money. So that is, not all people were equally affected. Now our next and last topic of this chapter is conclusion. So conclusion, what is the conclusion of this chapter? Now in this chapter we had seen about the Africa, about the Maasais. Now we have not discussed about the many communities of Africa, but we have discussed about the Maasai, and that gives us a kind of, you could say that, a kind of situation. What was the situation in Africa due to colonial government? And in India we had seen that tribal communities have a very good break, you could say that, have a very major change because of modern world. Now they have to, many communities, many pastoral communities have to adapt themselves in the modern world. It is not that they are a kind of marginalized, you could say that, and it is not marginalized, you could say that they are not neglected. Now they are adapting themselves in the modern world a bit by bit, because the separation, the partition of any country or the limitations converting land into agricultural land has impacted them very much, and that's why they are adapting themselves a bit by bit nowadays. But it is still that you could say that ecologists and environmentalists have found that the pastoralism life form, the form of life of pastoralism is the suitable in the mountains, in the plateaus, are the most suitable, you could say, the form of living, you could say the means of living, are the most suitable means of living. that's a situation, that's a statement of ecologists and environmentalists, because it doesn't harm the environment that much. So the conclusion of this chapter is, you could say that it could be that the separation of country, of any partition of any country, the conversion of land into different areas has impacted our communities, our pastoral communities so much, but they now are adapting themselves bit by bit. You know that in colonial period as well as nowadays as well, there are many discrimination against them. So that's it we had discussed in this chapter. Now we have discussed about the pastoralism in the modern world. We have seen that what were the changes that were to them. Now you have seen about India, about the Gadis of Himachal Pradesh who do, you know that in summer they would go to the Lahul and Spiti regions, and in winter they would go to the Lahul and Spiti regions, and in summer they would go to the low upper hills of mountains. And we have discussed about the Gujar Bakarwals, we have discussed about the Raikas of Rajasthan, the Golas of Andhra Pradesh, the Dhangars of Maharashtra, and in Africa we have discussed about the Maasai of Tanzania. Now there is one most important point that you have to remember, that now these communities of India you have to remember about on the map as well. Now you must practice them on maps as well, because in examinations, in your school exams, it would be that you would have to show those communities which state they belong to. You will have to prove it. You will have to mark it on the map from which state they belong to. So that would be a very big question. You must practice it, because it is very important for exams. So I have discussed about the pastoralism in the modern world. We have seen about the pastoralism, we have seen about the pastoral nomads, we have seen about Africa and in India as well. So that's it, and this is also the last chapter of this book. After this, all chapters from this book, from class 9th history, have been completed. Now this is the last chapter, and I have discussed all topics and subtopics, and I'll be soon starting the civics of this class. So thank you very much.